Welcome, Devon. I'm so pleased to have you again. Since I'll admit I'm human and I forgot to record when you were with us with the memoir cohort and gave such an excellent session and answering questions. So I'm just going to introduce you and then we're going to, recap some of the questions and my gratitude. So with that,
Sure. Thanks for having me back.
let's do this. So Devon Sivill has been practicing as a litigation lawyer in Ontario since 2014. He opened his law practice there on October 23rd, practicing civil litigation, employment law, human rights, administrative law, and defamation, which is of prime interest to our writers. We operate in a virtual first environment, or he does, and represent clients throughout Ontario and at every level of court. In Devon's presentation to the memoir cohort, he knew that I had people from California and BC, so he brought information pertinent to them. Although you will give your disclaimer, Devon, over to you about how much you can refer people but you practice in Ontario. So just maybe you go ahead and say a little bit their disclaimer.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, thanks Rusty for having me back. I'm really happy to be here to answer questions. By way of a disclaimer, I'll just say that as you said in the introduction, I am an Ontario lawyer, which means I'm licensed to practice law and give legal advice in the province of Ontario. To the extent that what we're talking about today, defamation has a number of different laws depending on your jurisdiction. I'll just say that I'm happy to provide legal advice with respect to the laws in Ontario, and otherwise, the information that I'm going to give today is general legal information. And I always do suggest that if you're not in the jurisdiction in Ontario, I would suggest that you consult with a legal professional in your own jurisdiction to get advice on your own situation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we won't be able to cover all the amazing things. And Devon had a handout for the people on Thursday last week, and we can make that available if people are interested in contact Devon. We'll make sure Devon's contact information is available on this video. But we talked about the 5 best practices to protect yourself from defamation is to be truthful, use verifiable corroborating sources, anonymize identities and factual details, which leads me to one of the questions one of my memoir writers asked. If she's going to write about a short, pudgy creep from the past, can she write about this person and maybe just change a few of the details? Would that be enough to identify a person?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a question that I often get as a defamation litigator. What in fact is enough in terms of trying to change details? And I think what we need to come back to is the test for defamation. And so, to be very clear, in different jurisdictions there are slightly different tests, but in general, you're talking about words that would have the effect of lowering the reputation of intended plaintiff, so of somebody who's going to sue for defamation. Those words have to be conveyed to more than just the plaintiff themselves, and the plaintiff has to suffer damages as a result. And so those are sort of the 3 things that you're looking at. And so the question in your mind should always be, are those words about the plaintiff, or could somebody connect them reasonably to somebody that you're writing about? So obviously, every case is different, and defamation in general is very, very fact specific. But what I would say is, if you've got somebody who's writing about a short, pudgy creep, and you've managed to anonymize, most of the details such that there may be some element of truth and some that has been you've taken some creative license, I think you're probably safe. Again, it's going to depend on each situation, but the reality is, as artists and as authors, we want some level of authenticity in our writing because that's what adds value to it. So, I would always say work with your legal advisors, work with your publishing team to figure out exactly in a particular circumstance what's enough. But I guess the short answer to your question is, if you've anonymized all of these details, I think that's probably the best that you can do, because the other thing we'll say is that defending against defamation is a bit of an art and not necessarily a hard science.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking while you were talking, and I'm going to put a little bit of a twist on the question that I didn't think about last week, in that
Sure.
if that short, pudgy creep, let's just use those 3 adjectives, if that short, pudgy creep can actually identify himself, because the author is going to write not under a pseudonym, but yet everybody else in the world would say, well, you're short and you're pudgy and you're a bit of a creep. And but yet she anonymized the time, the place, the details. Like let's say they had a certain kind of business dealing together and they did something else in another city, another province, another state, country, whatever. She anonymized those details, but he still knows it's him, but nobody else could identify him by the other really distinguishing details of the facts and the time and the place and the actual details of their whatever the relationship was. I was just thinking, it's kind of interesting because he could maybe be able to identify himself, but he couldn't prove that anybody else really could.
That's right. And because you put a riff on the question, I'll put a riff on the answer.
Okay.
And the riff on the answer is this, is that when we think about defamation, what we have to think about is, you're talking about impugning somebody's reputation.
Yeah.
And you're talking about whether or not what you've said could reasonably impugn somebody's reputation such that they would suffer damages.
Right.
Now, when we talk about damages, one of the things we have to talk about, and this wasn't really a big part of the presentation that I gave, but when we talk about damages, we're talking about reputational damages or damages that flow from damages to your reputation. So, for example, in many jurisdictions, if you're writing or making comments about a public figure, the damages that public figure could pursue are going to be elevated because they're a public figure,
Mm.
right? By the same token, if nobody else, coming back to your question, if nobody else can identify you, to some extent, damages are presumed. But I think the where that becomes relevant is if nobody else can identify you, sure, there may be some presumed damage to reputation. But again, if people can't identify that you're communicating about them to other people, I think you're going to have a good case to be able to defend. It doesn't mean that you would get out of it without a lawsuit, but certainly you'd have some ammunition to try and defend that.
Right. I forgot about an alarm to open my Monday room that's happening later. Silly. One
That's
thing,
okay. No
always one
problem.
thing. That's
No
great.
problem.
I just wanted to play with that, and thanks for playing with me on that question. One of the other
Sure.
participants asked about siblings. Could siblings sue if they didn't agree with the writer's view of the parents that are and have been deceased for years?
Yeah. So again, a great question, and I think we need to differentiate a little bit between. I'll use the example of siblings with parents, between parents who are deceased and parents who are not deceased,
Mm.
right? So using the fact pattern where parents are deceased, I think what some people may not realize is yes, if you make defamatory comments about somebody who is deceased, it is possible that their estate, via their estate trustees, could potentially bring an action for defamation. And we've seen that happen before, not just in Ontario, but in all of the jurisdictions we were servicing with your memoir group. The you know, the reality is, though, there are a number of legal steps that have to happen in order for an estate to bring a case like that, not least of which is the appointment of an estate trustee. So, for example, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds with estate law, but what I'd say is, you know, you've got to have the appointment of a litigation guardian. There are a number of different procedures steps that you have to go through. So it's not just sort of a snap decision. Hey, I read this and I didn't like it, so I'm going to bring this lawsuit on behalf of my parents' estate. Um, you know, the other thing that I think becomes a relevant factor is, if they're deceased, to what extent has the estate suffered damage because of the presumably defamatory content, right? And I think you would have to show that there has been monetary damage to the estate if the estate's bringing the action, in order for you to be able to substantiate a defamation claim. So, to use the example of famous people, I mean, there was that very famous case a while back of Michael Jackson,
Yeah.
right? We know that if people believe something about a famous person, there are potential damages. But if no disrespect to any of our deceased parents, but but if you're simply writing about your deceased parents, whether or not they're famous enough that might result in, financial damage to the value of the estate, I don't know. And I think that's really something you'd want to work with your defense counsel on.
Excellent. Thank you very much for filling in the blanks with those generalities so that people know that they do need, if that is any possibility at all being an issue, they do need to talk to a lawyer before they write their own personal experience. Because one woman I worked with, she was the last of 11 children. She was born after the war in Holland, and the other siblings all lived through the shortages, the scarcity, and the threat of violence. And so her view of her childhood was beautiful and free and loving and kind. And when she wrote about her past, that's not true. That's not true. But she had a different set of parents that weren't impacted by the war and food scarcity and
For
rations.
sure.
So it's one example of how siblings' realities can be different, so different from one sibling to another, and important to consider these things. I have two final
Absolutely.
questions, and one I forgot to ask last week that just touch upon it briefly is that I know that one of the authors asked her former husband to sign a waiver because she was telling her story in a memoir, and her daughter took it to the father. And he said, absolutely, anything that helps her move ahead. And it was very kind, very non conflictual. Is a waiver enough? And that's a tough.
So that's a it's a specific question with a specific answer, and I'm
Yes.
gonna try not to use the lawyerly cop out in answering the question. But I think the overarching thing that I want to say is it would depend on what's in the waiver. So when we talk about waivers, we want to make sure from the artist's perspective, and again, I'm talking about from the perspective of artists and authors, in an ideal world as a lawyer, when an artist or an author comes to me and says, I want a waiver, my immediate reaction as a lawyer is, okay, let's draft the broadest possible waiver. We're going to throw everything in the kitchen sink in there, because if we can capture whatever the potential alleged conduct is going to be in the future with a waiver, that's going to be the best case scenario for the author and artist. Now, realistically, courts have said you can't have these sort of super open-ended waivers. And, certainly lawyers have argued in the past that a waiver is overbroad. And so, they've attempted to cast the net essentially too wide. But the reality is, if you have a well-written waiver that basically articulates that the person signing it understands what the rights are that they have and understand the rights that they are giving up as a result of signing that waiver, and that they're doing so, freely and fairly and without duress, then I think that goes a long way to insulating you. And so I always suggest, where there is a potential, and certainly where there's a dialogue that you're able to have with the individual, and there may be a possibility that they would sign a waiver. A
Mhm.
waiver is always a best practice when you're writing about somebody else.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much for that. And the final question is the question that somebody had asked about illegal activities, that there was a lot of drugs and dealing and that, and now totally recovered, working in peer-to-peer support, doing amazing work with other people recovering from the trauma of drug addiction and substance use disorder. Absolutely amazing human being. Asked about how do we write about situations and people and even themselves if there was suspicion of criminal activity, but they were never charged, never sentenced. How do they go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a difficult one for a lot of writers and artists. I guess what I would say is this, is that it is always advisable in cases like that, whether you're talking about it in the prose of your writing or whether you use a foreword or an afterword, to say that if you're going to refer to those events where there's been no charges and no imprisonment, no conviction, anything like that, you want to make sure you say that. And part of the reason for that is, in Ontario and in many of the other jurisdictions that I presented on, what we know is that your damages elevate when you accuse somebody in a defamatory manner of criminal activity that they haven't been convicted of. Because obviously, as you can imagine, if you're accusing somebody of criminal activity, whether you're doing it with the best of intentions or whether you're trying to be authentic about it, the reality is the consequence to them can be very great. So what courts have said is if you're going to make a defamatory comment and that comment relates to a criminal charge, then in fact the damages are going to be greater and more elevated. So I always suggest make sure that you say uh, in the pros or in a forward or in an afterword that if you're going to talk about those things, that no charges have ever been laid and no convictions have ever been entered. It becomes very different if there are charges and convictions because those things are matters of public record that can be verified with relative ease.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is fantastic. Thank you so much for recapping those main questions that were asked. People, if you weren't part of the memoir group, Devon gave such a huge and wonderful presentation covering so many bases in ways that still, had to be general because not all of us are from Ontario. In fact, only one of my writers was from Ontario. But you covered the bases with generalities for the people that were from California and the people from BC. And there's more in his handout that he prepared for us about work with your publication team and legal advisors with some advice there, and be aware of anti-SLAPP legislation. And I'm going to leave you with a curiosity of what that is, because Devon is most open to receiving calls, making referrals to people if you live elsewhere, because he's got connections and he knows what he's talking about. So thank you so very much, Devon. Any final words? And I will make sure that where this appears, that all of your information, contact information is there and available.
Excellent, Rusty. Well, thank you very much for having me back to answer some questions. I would just say, if you're curious about defamation law, or if you have people in your network that are curious about defamation law, if you live in Ontario, you can always give us a call. If you live elsewhere, I mean, by all means, reach out to us. Rusty's going to provide you with my contact information, and we'll do what we can to provide a referral. Certainly, I hope that for your sakes as artists and as authors, that we're not in a position where we're facing defamation, but to the extent that we can help you avoid that, we're happy to do that. So thank you very much again for the opportunity.
You're so welcome. And Devon's website address is his name, Devon Sivill. And imagine a Sivill Law, Devon Sivill Law, DevonSivill.ca. And again, I'll make all of his information available wherever this video appears. Thank you so much, Devon. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Rusty.